Behind every locked door lies a story the world was never meant to hear. Welcome to Behind Bars TV, where we uncover the hidden realities of the world's toughest prisons, untold inmate experiences, and the systems built to contain them. From supermax facilities to forgotten penitentiaries, we reveal the truth behind concrete walls and razor wire. This is not fiction. This is the world behind bars. They built it to be the end of the line, a place where America's most dangerous men could disappear forever. No sunlight, no human contact, no sound except your own thoughts. Welcome to Pelican Bay State Prison, the prison that changed America. Pelican Bay, the prison that changed America. Built to control chaos, it became a factory for it. This is the story of the experiment that went too far, and the men who fought back from inside the cage. The birth of the beast. In the 1980s, California's prison system was collapsing. Violence was epidemic. Gangs ruled entire yards. The state's response wasn't mercy, it was control. In 1989, they began construction on a new kind of prison. A fortress built not to rehabilitate, but to isolate. A place so secure that no riot could break its walls. Pelican Bay State Prison opened in 1989. A $277 million high-tech nightmare designed to hold the men America couldn't handle anywhere else. They called it a prison within a prison. The inmates called it the box. Inside the SHU, prisoners live in windowless cells the size of a parking space. 23 hours a day, alone. Meals pushed through a slot. No contact visits. No programs. No phone calls. Pelican Bay was the government's ultimate weapon. Total sensory deprivation. The code of control. Every inch of Pelican Bay was engineered for obedience. Infrared cameras. Electronic gates. Concrete yards the size of dog runs. Even conversations were monitored through vents. The design was psychological as much as physical. No colors, no windows, no clocks. Time itself was erased. The idea, said one former warden, was to make violence impossible by removing every human stimulus. But something else happened instead. They didn't erase violence. They erased humanity. Cut off from the world, inmates built their own system. A code of power enforced through communication that even the guards couldn't stop. Letters written in microscopic script. Messages hidden in artwork. A whisper from one cell to another could spark chaos 1,000 miles away. In trying to kill the gangs, Pelican Bay taught them how to rule in silence. The war inside the walls. By the mid-1990s, Pelican Bay had become a battleground. Inside the SHU, for major gangs carved the prison into invisible empires. The Mexican Mafia, La Im, the Nuestra Familia, the Aryan Brotherhood, and the Black Guerrilla Family. Each faction used coded networks to run drug trades, extortion, and assassinations, not just inside Pelican Bay, but across the entire California system. It was a war without sound, said a retired investigator. Orders written in toothpaste caps, blood spilled without a word. The prison meant to end gang control had become their headquarters. Pelican Bay didn't stop the violence. It centralized it. The cost of isolation. By 1993, stories began leaking out. Men who'd spent years alone spoke of hallucinations, paranoia, and self-harm. Some stopped speaking entirely. Others screamed through the night until their voices broke. If you talk to yourself long enough, one inmate said, you start to answer. Human rights groups called it torture. The state called it security. Pelican Bay wasn't just changing prisoners. It was changing America's definition of punishment. The architects of solitude. Pelican Bay wasn't designed by wardens or politicians. It was designed by engineers, people who believed they could solve violence with architecture. They didn't build a prison. They built a psychological experiment. But the architects underestimated one thing. Human beings will always find ways to connect, even through concrete. By removing windows, they created imagination. By removing voices, they created code. By removing movement, they created defiance. In trying to control the body, They accidentally weaponized the mind. Letters from the box. Even in isolation, the human spirit finds a voice. Inmates began writing letters, thousands of them, to families, activists, lawyers, and journalists. Every word had to pass through censors, but the message was unstoppable. We are not animals. We are men, and we are losing our minds in here. The letters became bridges, and bridges became movements. These letters reached the Prison Law Office, the ACLU, and human rights groups across California. For the first time, the outside world began to see Pelican Bay not as a prison, but as a moral crisis. America had built a dungeon it could no longer justify. Madrid versus Gomez, the lawsuit that shook the system. In 1993, inmates filed a landmark lawsuit, Madrid versus Gomez. They accused Pelican Bay of violating the Eighth Amendment, the constitutional ban on cruel and unusual punishment. The case revealed horrors no one could deny. Beatings by guards. Inmates shot during fights. Mentally ill prisoners locked in solitary cells for years. One investigator called it a place where torture is routine and mercy is rare. In 1995, the judge ruled Pelican Bay's conditions were unconstitutional for the mentally ill, but legal for everyone else. It was a victory, one attorney said, but it felt like a funeral. The machine kept running, just slower, quieter, smarter. The hunger strike revolution. For 2 decades, Pelican Bay's SHU kept men silent. But in 2011, that silence broke. Thousands of inmates across California refused food in a coordinated protest. The largest prison hunger strike in U.S. history. Their demands: end indefinite solitary confinement. Stop punishment based on gang validation. Allow basic human contact. They couldn't speak, so they starved. The protest forced California lawmakers to confront a truth long buried under concrete. Pelican Bay wasn't solving crime. It was manufacturing despair. The men who led the revolution. The hunger strike didn't begin in a yard. It began in a letter. For men locked in windowless cells for decades, used tiny scraps of paper to plan a protest that would reach 30,000 inmates across the state. They built a revolution through the mail. These leaders had been labeled worst of the worst, gang generals beyond redemption. But when they called for unity, something historic happened. Men from rival races, white, Latino, and black, agreed to a ceasefire. We will not fight each other, they wrote. Our fight is with the system. In isolation, they built solidarity. In silence, they built peace. When the world finally looked inside, the hunger strikes changed everything. For the first time, cameras entered Pelican Bay's SHU. The world saw what solitary really meant. Cold metal, no windows, no sound. Psychologists, journalists, and senators began calling it by its real name, torture. You don't see time here, said one visitor. You see it die. Public pressure forced reform. By 2015, California agreed to end indefinite solitary confinement. Hundreds of Pelican Bay prisoners were moved out of the SHU. After 25 years, the silence was finally broken. Life after the box. When the SHU doors opened in 2015, hundreds of men stepped out of isolation, not into freedom, but into shock. Some had spent 20 to 30 years without sunlight, sound, or touch. Now, traffic noises and human voices felt like storms. You think you want freedom, one man said, until you get it all at once. Psychologists called it post-solitary syndrome. Some couldn't sleep without the hum of fluorescent lights. Others couldn't eat without the metal clink of a tray. They released men whose bodies were free, but minds were still caged. When the door finally opens, some part of you stays behind it. The guards' confessions. Pelican Bay didn't just change prisoners. It changed those who guarded them. Guards were trained to see silence as success. But decades of enforcing isolation took a toll. You stop seeing inmates as people, said one retired officer. Then one day, you realize you stopped seeing yourself too. They built a wall around the prison and carried it inside themselves. The political fallout. The hunger strikes and lawsuits forced California to reckon with its own creation. Investigations found that over 1,000 men had been held in solitary for more than a decade, some for life. "We became the world's experiment in isolation," said one senator. But reform met resistance. Victims' groups feared leniency. Prison unions feared chaos. The state feared losing control. Every reform has a price, and every system fights for survival. The legacy of Pelican Bay. Pelican Bay was born from fear, but it left behind a strange inheritance: awareness. The prison story ignited a national debate. States from New York to Texas reviewed their own SHU units. Even the UN cited Pelican Bay when condemning prolonged solitary confinement as psychological torture. It forced America to look into a mirror it didn't want to see. Pelican Bay taught us that control without compassion isn't safety, it's surrender. The prison that changed America. More than 30 years after its first inmate arrived, Pelican Bay still stands, silent, gray, watchful. Some call it progress. Others call it a wound that never healed. But no one denies its power. It changed how America punishes, protests, and perceives human endurance. They built it to control men. Instead, it revealed what happens when a nation tries to bury its conscience behind concrete. The experiment spreads. Pelican Bay was never just a prison. It was a prototype. After its success in controlling gang violence, other states copied its model. By 2005, more than 60 supermax facilities had opened nationwide, all inspired by Pelican Bay's control unit blueprint. Isolation became America's export. Across the country, prisoners began living the same life. 23-hour lockdowns, no human contact, no rehabilitation. "We didn't build one Pelican Bay," said a former warden. "We built 50. The experiment had escaped the lab. The media looks inside. For years, Pelican Bay was hidden, invisible to the public eye. Then came the cameras. In 2012, reporters were finally allowed to film inside the SHU. Viewers saw something few Americans had ever imagined. Men who hadn't touched another human in decades. They spoke softly. They blinked at light. And they made America uncomfortable. The footage went viral. Millions watched. The myth of Pelican Bay's safety was gone. In trying to hide violence, they built it in silence. And silence became the story. The network lives on. Even after the SHU's reform, the old codes of Pelican Bay lived on. The same men once locked alone for decades began reconnecting with the outside. Through contraband phones, family lines, and coded communication. The Aryan Brotherhood, Mexican Mafia, and Nuestra Familia adapted, turning their decades of isolation into systems of invisible leadership. They learned how to control an army without ever leaving a cell. Even as reformers celebrated, the question lingered. Did Pelican Bay end the gangs or teach them to evolve? The new generation. A new generation entered Pelican Bay, not as soldiers of the old war, but as witnesses to its aftermath. Some had fathers who'd spent half their lives in the SHU. Others were born during the hunger strikes. To them, Pelican Bay wasn't a legend. It was inheritance. They were raised on stories of silence, but they wanted sound. Programs now teach emotional regulation, mentorship, and conflict resolution, words never heard in the 1990s. "We can't erase what Pelican Bay was," says a counselor, "but we can make sure it's never repeated." The next generation may finally be the one that breaks the cycle. The mirror. Pelican Bay is still standing, gray, silent, unchanged. But what it represents has shifted. For some, it's a warning. For others, a reminder. "Every country has a mirror," says one reformer. "Ours just happens to be made of concrete." Pelican Bay changed America, not because it broke men, but because those men forced the nation to look at itself. The silence that began here still echoes. What you just saw is more than a story. It's a reality lived by thousands behind bars. If you believe in uncovering the truth, the kind hidden behind concrete walls and silence, then join us. Subscribe to Behind Bars TV and never miss a chapter in the world's most dangerous stories. Until next time, stay aware, stay informed, and remember, freedom and confinement are sometimes only a wall apart.